Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levin Institute for the Humanities and the USC Society of Fellows. And this workshop today is part of the Levin Institute's How To series, where we discuss how humanists do what we do. And it is part of a series that was organized at the behest of the postdoctoral fellows in the society who had ideas of workshops that they thought would be helpful for grad students, postdocs, and junior faculty. So this is our second of these workshops, and stay tuned for the spring. We have more coming up on such subjects as publishing your first book, where we will be speaking with editors from different presses, formulating second projects, and models for collaboration in the humanities. So if you're not signed up for our newsletter, please visit our website and sign up so that you can get that information. The format for this workshop is pretty simple. We will be together for an hour. We will have very short comments by three speakers who have kindly agreed to give their thoughts, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A, which I will be moderating, and I will just ask that when we get to that part, you use the Zoom function, blue hand, raise your hand, so that I get a cue and can go in that order. Our three speakers today, and we will go in alphabetical order, are three dear colleagues: Alice Echols, the Barbra Streisand Professor of Contemporary Gender Studies and Professor of History at USC; Peter Mancall, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of the Humanities; Linda and Harlan Martens, Director of the Early Modern Studies Institute and Professor of History and Anthropology, and I should say current Dean of Social Sciences and former longtime Dean of Humanities; and Peter Redfield, Professor and Chair of Anthropology, and Robert F. Erburu, Chair in Ethics, Globalization, and Development. So thank you so much, Alice, Peter, and Peter, for agreeing to talk. And Ali, I think, yes, Alice, alphabetically, you are first.
Everyone, it's great to see faces. I mean, I wish I saw a few more faces there, because it is really nice to see actual people. So I want to begin by saying that, you know, none of us who are going to be speaking today really knows what the future holds. I mean, I think that's obvious. But we do know this is really not an optimal time. And so as I thought about my remarks for today, I was thinking that, you know, the real challenge here is to not give false hope, but also to not fuel despair. And on the topic of despair, one hurdle that I think some of you may face is the fear that at the end of this, you know, at the end of your postdoc, at the end of your PhD, what you're going to face is working as a barista at Starbucks, or if you're very lucky, at Pete's. And one of the reasons I say this is that I was talking to a friend of mine who was I think earned her PhD in about 2017. And she was saying that was very much her fear. She's now very happily employed as a journalist. Now, I think other people are going to be focused much more on alt-ac than I am. I'm going to be talking today about how to stay connected to and positioned in the academy, how to keep yourself in the game and maximize your chances of getting a tenure track position. This is a strategy that can, in fact, work for several years. And I know of somebody who was a 2008 USC PhD who 8 years later snagged a job at an R1, a very good job, and is now on the brink of getting tenure. As I thought about this, it seemed to me that there are three key factors. One of them is intellectual community / networking, and the two are connected, but they are somewhat different. I suspect that everybody in this room has an intellectual community. It's your grad student cohort, and that can be incredibly sustaining. It certainly is for my grad students. It was for me. It still is for me, and I'm 69 years old. But of course, that's not enough. You have to build your community out. And so I think it's really important moving forward. I'm sure many of you are already doing this, but reaching out to other people who are engaged in the sort of research that you're doing. Taking part in relevant study groups, in working groups. There are many such working groups and study groups at USC, but also beyond. Many professional organizations today are running virtual conferences, they're running study groups and working groups. It's important to be a member of at least one professional organization, and I think to be part of what's happening there, to be part of the intellectual life. Planning panels with other young scholars. And the other thing I would say is don't be shy about contacting a more established scholar. The worst that can happen is they won't write you back, or they'll say that they don't have time. But that's not a bad idea. So number two, reaching beyond your silo. When you're writing, and I'm going to be talking, I mean, really in very practical terms here. When you're writing your grant application, realize that most of the people reading it are not going to be field specialists, you know? So you have to reach beyond your own field. Whether you're writing a grant app, you're writing a job letter, you're giving a job talk, you have to know what the stakes of your project are. You have to know why it matters. Because there's going to be somebody out there saying, you know, I don't really get this. Why should I care about this? There is a person in the history department who almost always asks this question, and they do exist in other departments. I would say another key thing is learning how to give a talk in a way that breaks with the time-honored academic tradition of addressing your comments to the paper on the podium. I've been in a lot of searches, and I continue to see this style, and it's not a winning strategy. So things you can do, you can practice with PowerPoints. You don't want to ever read the language on the slide, in my view. Maybe with students, but not in a job talk. But if you do a PowerPoint that offers you an outline, you can have the hard copy, the piece of paper in front of you, but that can serve as a guide as you're giving your job talk. If you're not comfortable doing that, then have as a PowerPoint photographs, right? That you can break from your text and engage your audience. It's really important to engage an audience. As you can see, I'm not doing a PowerPoint. The other thing I would say is also to be visible. You know, this is a strategy that is going to rely upon your visibility and probably also, sadly, being self-promoting. Perhaps keep a web page, perhaps do a blog. I'm going to put some examples of things up in the chat, and I'm going to put one that's related to a young queer historian named Hugh Ryan. The third thing I would say is public-facing scholarship. I think this is going to be the challenge and the opportunity for people in the humanities. The days of theoretically driven scholarship, highly specialized scholarship are not over, but it is my sense that in the near future, I think a lot of academic institutions are going to be looking for work that is more public facing, work that engages a wider public. Crossover scholarship requires, I think, at least in these times, also finding connections between what's happening in the world, what is newsworthy, and your own research. And I think writing op-eds is a good exercise. I'm going to put up in the chat the link to the conversation, which is quite useful. And this leads me to the final point. And I know that there's going to be a workshop that's going to be related to this that follows this workshop. But I want to mention that one possibility in charting this particular path that I'm laying out of trying to stay in the game is thinking about publishing your first book with a trade publisher. Now, this is something that younger scholars were warned off of because the fear was that tenure committees would look at such a book and say, this is not up to snuff. But, things have changed. A lot of university presses have academic arms, and very often these manuscripts are vetted, they're peer reviewed. So that gets you over that particular hurdle. One example that I think is a really good example, not of that, but of a truly trade press book, is a book called The Equivalence that came out recently. And it's written by a recent Harvard Ph.D. who does not seem to have academic employment at this particular time. I think there's an upside and there's a downside to trade publishing. I have a lot of experience in it, so I'm happy to talk about it here. I'm happy to talk about it at a following workshop. What we haven't talked about, and we may want to in the Q&A, is what kind of work you find in this period, this sort of transitional, what one hopes is a transitional period. Does one accept adjuncting work? On what kinds of adjunct work? Do you want to pursue work that, in fact, quite deliberately isn't that kind of work? And I think that's something that we can talk about in the Q&A. So I will pass it on to, I guess it would be Peter Mancall.
Thanks, Alice. Alice, Peter, and I sort of didn't coordinate very well. So actually, I was going to talk about non-academic things, but Alice hit some of the exact specific things I was going to say. So I'm going to apologize for redundancy. But since Alice, I think, laid out did a great job of laying out how to think about going into academics, I want to talk about the broader non-academic picture. I also want to make a quick comment about universities. When you started graduate school, the university environment was very different than the university environment that exists today. Pandemic, another economic downturn, a real shift in the way that people think about universities, the continuing cultural erosion of the power of the humanities. These things have made it difficult. And so I think that there are a lot of headwinds. That said, I think there's a lot. I think your career paths are all going to be bright. I just wanted to start with the downer side, so then the rest is all upside from here, or I hope so, at least. So I'm just going to go over a few things that I talked about with my own students. And actually, I noticed that a couple of my postdocs I'm mentoring are here also, so I'm happy to see them here. So I want to just, I want to pick up on one theme that Alice said as a way to go in a different direction. And what Alice was basically saying was the importance of staying connected and staying in various kinds of networks. There's a phrase in real estate, which is ABC, always be closing, but the phrase for academics should be ABA, always be applying. It is hard. What is coming is hard. But one of the things, I talked to one of my graduate students about this just last week, money follows money. Grants follow grants. Larger grants follow smaller grants. So you may see, for example, some small grant somewhere, $500, $1,000, and you think, is that worth it? It is absolutely worth it for the line on your CV, in addition to whatever kind of cash it provides in the short term. And I can tell you that I built a lot of my grants career, starting with small grants and then moving into larger grants. Those grants do not need to take you just to an academic direction. They open up other ways of communicating with a broader audience. And I think one of the things that Alice said is very important. We could beat ourselves bloody wondering why humanists no longer talk to wide audiences, but the fact remains we have somehow lost some of our footing in the larger conversation. If you look at a typical university undergraduate population now, I'll use USC as an example, the number of students who are enrolling in social sciences, natural sciences, simply dwarfs what is going on in humanities departments. This is a challenge to us. We shouldn't throw up our hands and say we shouldn't do anything. It's a challenge. How do we win people back? Because we want to be teaching more students at the undergraduate level, because we want those students when they go out into their careers to understand what it is we as humanists do. So just some sort of practical suggestions. When you go into graduate, I'll be honest with you, when I started my PhD and the academic environment was better, it was kind of sucky then too, but it was better than it is now. I didn't know if I was going to end up in a perfect, a permanent academic position. I feel very fortunate that I did. But I figured that a PhD, that spending time doing something I really loved, in my case, I'm an early American historian, would be a really great way to spend 4, 5, 6 years and set me up for whatever comes next. I think that's very important. I think that many of you have advisors, and I'm one of these advisors, who sort of accept graduate students with the presumption that we want to steer you towards replicating ourselves, towards going into a tenure track kind of position. And we're going to give you advice that will open that career path. And I think by and large, that advice is probably very sound advice. But there are other career paths to think about. If you look, it depends on your interests, but if you look at who works at foundations, museums, archives and libraries, there are tons of people with PhDs, including PhDs in the humanities. A huge area of employment, which we actually have a program that we're cultivating, is to think about permanent positions in academic administration. The USC administration is filled with people with PhDs, and so is every major university and college in the United States. These are great, stable jobs with a stable employer. It's not the same as being in the classroom, but the rest of the benefits of being in the university climate are there. And this is a real growth area. And it's the reason we have a grant from the Mellon Foundation. As you may know, the Mellon Foundation is the largest funder of the humanities, because the Mellon Foundation believes that this is an area of possible growth for humanities PhDs. So it's worth bearing in mind. And again, there are plenty of people at USC you could talk to who have gone in that kind of direction. Alice mentioned something, actually she mentioned the conversation, which I was going to mention too. Alice mentioned something that is important for an academic career, but it's also important for a non-academic career. And that is how to tell the story of what you're doing to a public that is not just composed of other PhDs, right? How to take whatever the core idea you have and explain it in plain language. One of the reasons sometimes really great proposals don't get funded is because even people who are academics do not want to spend their time working through convoluted prose. We have to find a way just to speak more directly. So if you're applying for a grant, you figure out what the grant funders are looking for and you tailor your application to it. That same logic should work if you want to look for a job at a museum or in a foundation or a library or archive. Or also, I'm going to throw this out, there are growing numbers of PhDs, it's not going to be a surprise, in tech. You know, tech is a booming part of our economy going forward. I am contacted regularly. I'm sure that Peter and Alice and Danielle are contacted by people in tech companies. Hey, we're thinking about X, Y, and Z. Do you have any thoughts? Just sort of kick around ideas. They want smart, engaged, educated people. And while it might be a very different career than what you went into graduate school thinking, it is possible that they're going to be interested in you. Because there's one thing that you have to remember that I tell my own students, and it's going to seem almost Pollyanna-ish. Getting a PhD, you know, in some theoretical world means you've made a contribution to knowledge. That's great. Getting a PhD shows a potential employer that you know how to complete a long-term complicated project. That is a very important skill that PhDs bring into the market that virtually no one else has. That someone with a PhD can say, yes, I'm going to work on this complicated project for a while, and I have a track record of bringing it to completion. It's a way of thinking about the skill sets that each of you have, that all of us in this room have, but applying them and talking about them for different audiences. I think I'm going to pass it now to my colleague in anthropology, my other department, to see what Peter has to say, and then I'm happy to see where this conversation goes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I will pick up the baton then from Alice and Peter. and make the same confession because we didn't coordinate. There will be some probably areas of overlap, and there'll be things that we would want to return to in a broader discussion. Because I think, when I was looking at the title of this workshop, I was thinking, the title both promises all kinds of solutions or potential solutions. It promises the possibility of solutions to a problem. And each solution for any individual in this room would be different than the solution for other individuals. And so it's a difficult task to try and speak generally to an audience that's composed of people who are following their own particular life course, which may head in many different directions. But I also wanted, like my namesake who spoke previously, I wanted to start with something of a bit of a downer, to note that it's almost never been easy to get an academic job. If you look historically, we don't know what the future is going to bring, but we can say some things about the past. There's a brief period in the late 1950s through the 1960s where in American higher education, there's university expansion. Otherwise, the market has never been particularly great. There have been times when it's been better and times when it's worse, and right now it's clearly terrible. But that doesn't mean that it's been wonderful in the past. And there is a piece of literature I would point you to in terms of anchoring this or thinking about this, which is an essay by the German sociologist Max Weber, Science as a Vocation, which comes from 1919. It's right in the aftermath of World War I. And he's essentially, it's about a lot of things, but part of what it is he's telling young academics how difficult it is to have an academic career in Germany in 1919. And so I point to that because there are a couple of things that he says that I think are worth bearing in mind. If you do want an academic job and to pursue that pathway, you have to understand from the outset, it's not simply a meritocracy. It's a world that's full of contingency. It's not that you're necessarily going to get your just rewards. That's not how the world played out then. It's all white men in Germany. It's a very different world then, but I don't think it's much different now. And it's one where you have to be able to find your own inner passion and your own inner rewards for some of the things you do. You cannot depend on external rewards in order to keep yourself going. So I recommend that to you as partly also as a step of what I see as being one of the first tasks of thinking practically about what to do, which is also to acknowledge that it's psychologically stressful and difficult to be uncertain about what your future is, where you're going. And especially at a moment in history where everyone is uncertain about all kinds of things, including where the university is going in general, not just how each of our individual lives are going. And so I do think that that's something to keep in mind. And for me, the first practical thing which I tell you is I've always found it personally helpful to try and have perspective. And it's difficult in this business because everything feels personal. Your work is very personal. Every response you get feels very personalized, but a lot of the time it's not personal. If you apply to a position and there are hundreds of other people applying to the position, it's not that every single response is personal. Indeed, these days you usually don't get a response. I still have a folder of rejection letters that I received when I was applying for jobs, and I've kept them because I've thought at some point it would be useful for some art project or something to have them on hand, and also because it's a lost genre. People don't write rejection letters anymore, but it's a very interesting one of when the person whose responsibility it is to make a selection is trying to justify and explain to the poor soul who is not getting this position why that is the case. And so it's a very interesting literary genre in that sense, minor literary genre to look at. But it serves as a reminder for me as well of the contingency of all career paths. And if the three of us told you how we got to where we are, I'm sure it would be full of many things which would be very hard to replicate. It's not like there is one direct line and avenue to success. And it's also where we end up is very contingent in higher education. All of this is also true in non-academic careers. As I've gotten older and moved through life, and the cohort of people I grew up with have gone on and done different things, I've learned from them. And one of the things I've learned is that in every career path, there's lots of contingency. You know, if someone becomes a doctor, partly your life goes this way or that way, doors open or they don't open. And that's part of human experience of moving forward. Tragedies happen, wonderful things happen, and much of it is somewhat beyond our control. So I'm going on about this for a bit because I think it's important to both acknowledge this is a stressful moment, to recognize that, and think about how individually each of us tries to adjust to that. And for me, perspective I found always to be helpful. The second thing broadly, and we can come back and try and fill in more particularities and specificities if that's helpful in response to questions you may have. But broadly speaking, I would echo something that both Alice and Peter suggested, which is it helps to have some skills. And we're not used to thinking or focusing on skills. That's not the vocabulary in the academy. But if you move outside of the academy, that's very much the language in which you're going to have to re-articulate. You'll have to translate the things you know how to do into a somewhat different list. And you'll be surprised to find out that we actually know how to do things, that we've forgotten that we know how to do them, but to other people, they are more impressive perhaps than they are to us, because for us, they might be second nature. And the thing to keep in mind with any employer, with any job, is that they're trying to solve a problem. And can you solve that problem for them? That's the base. That's really what's going on in most job interviews and if you've ever hired someone in your life at some point, you know that there's an anxiety to hiring someone too, because you're not sure you're going to get a good employee. You're not sure you're going to get someone who's going to solve your problem. If you have a bad employee, then it's going to create more problems than you were hoping to solve with the position, whatever it is. So I just note that again, generally, these are very, very basic things, but think about the skills that you have, the skills that you can translate yourself into. And then thirdly, be flexible, both for academic futures and the kinds of things that you do moving forward. Recognize you're going to all of us have to be flexible at different moments in life. And that's absolutely true in the academic world. You have almost no choice usually about things like geography. If something opens for you in a particular part of the world and the door is open there, that may be the only door that opens for you. And it's not the case that you can dictate where you would stay. And there may be moments where you have to make trade-offs in your life, your personal life, your other aspects of things you like to do, and you may need to think about a variety of different possibilities. And in terms of non-academic positions as well, you may find yourself doing things that you never anticipated doing. And some of those may be onerous, in which case you should try and get out of it and do something else. But some of them may be enlightening, and they may open other doors later on to other kinds of possibility. So with any answer, anything that we say, I think it's also in terms of flexibility, and I'm about to end here on this theme, is that even if the general answer to something might be no, we don't think that's the best thing for everyone, there can still be exceptions where it might be a good thing to do. For example, adjuncting is not a great thing to do long-term unless it's a very good position or set of positions you can work out and it works with the rest of your life and you're working on your novel, and et cetera, et cetera. But short-term, it could be a very good thing to do, and it might resolve something for you in the immediate horizon. So you have to be thinking about the short-term future and the long-term future both at once. And again, that's stressful and not easy to do, but that's actually something that will stay with you the rest of your life, even if you are fortunate and you end up in a stable place, in a stable position. These issues, they recede, but they never entirely go away. And so I've gone on, as usual, the way that academics do, I've gone on a little too long on some of the things I thought I was going to say. So let's have a discussion, and I'm happy to be more specific to the extent I can.
Thank you so much, all three, Alice, Peter, and Peter. And we already have some questions coming up. And the first one is from Ashanti.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your knowledge with us. Just based on your own personal experiences, or perhaps also just experiences mentoring or reviewing applications, I was wondering actually a little bit about this last point that Peter made about adjuncting or perhaps leaving the tenure track market for a while for something completely unrelated to academia, or perhaps in nonprofits or administration or so on. How possible is it to leave for a period of time from this tenure track market and then go back to it perhaps, in 5 or 10 years or something? And something I've heard from others, which I wonder what you would think, is that it's possible, but you have to remain with one foot in academia by publishing and going to conferences and so on. Is that the general consensus? Okay, getting a lot of nods. So maybe that's a non-question. But if you feel free to elaborate if you have thoughts, I guess.
Well, I'm going to, Alice, I'll defer to Alice. Alice, you go first.
Oh, Alice, you're muted a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, the person whom I mentioned, who I referenced, who was a 2008 USC Ph.D. I mean, I really thought that he was past his sell-by date. I mean, he said to me, and I think it was 2015, he said, well, I'm going to try the job market again. He'd been adjuncting at USC mostly. And I just was not, I mean, he's very charismatic and his work is terrific, but I still was not optimistic. But this person had kept one foot in, not just by adjuncting, because that's not really keeping a foot in, because it's so marginalizing. Bracket the fact that at USC, RTPC faculty are not nearly as marginalized, I would argue, as they are, as as adjuncts are in many institutions, right? But this particular person had kept in the game in the way that I was, detailing. I mean, he was part of the larger conversation, and he had, and he knew how to make his book project speak to a larger audience. So I think I think, adjuncting is not really keeping you in the game. On the other hand, it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily an impediment. And I think that what Peter, the second Peter, said is true. It really depends on the circumstances.
So I'm going to follow that, Shanti, with a somewhat different take. I think that, not to be a downer, depending on how far you go out of the academy, it can be very hard to get back in. But what Alice is saying is, I think, really the core lesson. Everyone understands if we go out of the academy now for some time. It's how you structure that in the story that you tell about yourself, what you can do, and the arc of your career that will get a hiring committee to think, wait a minute, that wasn't a way just to kill time. That made her a better potential colleague. But it takes work. You do have to keep an academic career, something open on the side. I tell people, keep affiliations. Alice mentioned that, keep affiliations, whether that's a professional society or being, a member of some institute or some group, keep affiliations. Mm-hmm. But it's hard. But again, it's how you tell it. And to take what might seem a step that you took because you had nothing else, make it seem like this was my plan, this was the logical way to go, and this makes me a better scholar makes me a better historian, makes me a better whatever, because I've done that. And if you really want to get back into the academic thing, it seems to me what you need to be able to say, if you do that, is to say, I can bring this experience into the classroom, mm-hmm. and this makes me offer a wider variety of perspectives, which our undergraduates, very few of whom will ever go get a PhD, will benefit from, right? So, I mean, it just, there are ways of doing it. But then one last thing, Alice is right, our RTPC system is, whatever its flaws, far more humane than the vast majority of adjunct positions that are out there. Adjuncting, I think, it takes up a lot of time. A lot of these positions are very low compensation. And after you picked up some teaching experience, there is very useful a future employer doesn't see that you've taught taught this course 7 times as opposed to once, right? So it's hard to balance it. You know, we have to make a living, we have to do whatever, but again, integrate it into your narrative. That'd be my suggestion.
And I would just add quickly, for me, I think of this essentially like speaking a language. You have to keep it up in order to have some fluency in it, and you have to be able to translate. So I mean, that's just to repeat it another way. I think what both Alice and Peter were saying, that you have to be able to articulate it and make it clear what a language which might not be immediately apparent, or a set of positions or experiences to academics, you have to be able to translate them back into the language of academics. So keep enough of a foot in that you can still speak the language.
Thank you. Our next question is from Sean Fraga.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your thoughts on this, and particularly for the big picture and the reminders about the contingency of the academic job market and of life in general. I have what I think is probably a more granular or mechanical question about the hiring process. I think one of the big frustrations for me has been how opaque everything is. You send off your materials and you don't know what happens next. It's a black box. So I'm wondering if you can speak from a search committee perspective and tell us what documents do you look at first, and what parts within those documents do you look at? What are you looking for when you look at that big applicant pool? What tends to jump out?
It's a good question.
Alice, do you want to start, or do you want someone else to start?
Well, I mean, I can take a stab at it. I mean, I speak as a historian. I am always, I mean, obviously it depends upon, I mean, history ran 2 great big US history searches. And sort of almost everything, we sort of threw almost everything at the, you know, at the wall. It was almost every field. And what I mean, I guess people do this differently. I mean, there are people who will go to your referee letters first. There will be people who will go to the writing sample first. There will be people who will go to the CV first. I mean, I usually go to the applicant's job letter first. And then I go to the CV, and then I usually go to the referee letters. And one of the things that I'm trying to see is if the applicant is able to explain their project as well as their letter writers. I mean, to me, that's important. I don't want to read, I mean, I don't want to feel like, oh my God, you know, this letter writer understands this applicant's work better than the applicant, right? But I think each of us has a different style. And of course, I always look at the sample. I'm always looking for originality. I mean, I'm looking for 2 things. I mean, I'm looking as a historian, I'm looking at how well researched it is. I'm looking at the footnotes, you know, I'm looking at the methodology, and I'm looking at the originality. I mean, is this just telling me the same old thing, even if it's the most latest same old thing, right? Is there something unpredictable here? Is there a way in which this isn't just telling me what, you know, every other young scholar is telling me? So I may come at this a bit differently than the other 2 Peters.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. Peter, then if you don't mind, I'll jump first and then you jump. Okay, Sean, as someone who's written glowing letters for you, I will say right up front, I don't look at the letters of recommendation at all at first. I don't look at the letters of recommendation until it's narrowed down to who we should look at, because we live in Lake Wobegon, where everyone is brilliant, according to every letter of recommendation. I go immediately to the CV, period. And then I follow with the after job applicant's letter. And I remember, you know, it is worth, and maybe, I don't know if Danielle wants to join this conversation or not, it is worth having your CV look great. Because I will tell you, so embarrass her, I remember reading Daniela's CV when she was applied for a postdoc at USC. I thought to myself, wait, she's younger than me. Okay, maybe she's done less, but her CV is so great looking. It looks so much better than mine. And that might seem like a silly thing, but that I'm remembering this more than 3 or 4 years later.
Wait, so I was hired on looks of my CV?
Your CV was great. No, you were hired on the content of it. But I have to tell you that the CV, and I'm really going to apologize for what I'm about to say, but I'm about to say is just truthful. If you're applying for an academic job, if you don't have an article, your chances of making it to that first cut are going to be very hard. I don't think any hiring committee reasonably expects you to have a book contract for an entry-level position. But I think there are so many people. I mean, Alice referred to, that pool had like, what, 400 people in it? I mean, some absurd number. You know, there's one job or two jobs at the end. An article in a peer-reviewed journal, especially a well-recognized, if possible, peer-reviewed journal, especially one in the field in which you're applying, right? This is something you start out with your advisor in graduate school or your postdoc mentor. That's what leaps out on a CV. But a CV should be clear. And you might want to have more than one CV. There are people who say, well, you should have a different kind of CV for, you know, when you apply to a community college as opposed to applying for an R1 job. I think in a different world that was the case. Now everyone is publishing, so I'm not sure it's as much the case as it used to be. Yeah. But I think the CV is absolutely the first thing, and then the job letter. And by the way, the job letter I don't think should be more than 2 pages long. If you can't tell people what you've done in 2 pages, they're not going to be inclined to listen to you. You just have to, and this is something you should work on with your colleagues, with your mentors. You know, what is a great job letter look like? Okay.
You know, the one reason that I look at the job letter first, though, is I don't want to be too swayed by the institutional affiliation, you know? Although it is true that in that particular search with 400 odd candidates, I did sometimes look at the CV first. But that's the one thing that gives me pause.
Peter, yeah.
Yes, so I would say several things, echoing both Alice and Peter. For me, if you're, I mean, Sean, going back to your original question, I think part of what you're asking for is being able to imagine what happens once you send your application off, where it goes. And the answer to that is partly dependent on the kind of job and the kind of institution. American higher education is partly all local culture, even while at the same time there are general patterns. Different disciplines do things a little bit differently, and different universities do things a little bit differently, but there is a larger pattern. Most places there will be a search committee, and those will be the people who will sort through the stack of applications that come. Depending on the job and how specialized the job is, there'll be different numbers of applications coming in. The larger the number, if you just stop and imagine it, the larger the number, the more work the search committee has. And the harder it is for the search committee. The search committee are all people who are working academics. They are, you know, they have all their other stuff going on. They have good days and bad days. You know, they might be in a good mood or a bad mood. And this is both exciting, but also to be a part of a search, but also it's another work that you have to do on top of everything else that's going on. So those are some things to keep in mind. For me, I also look at the CV and I look at the job letter. And increasingly in anthropology, we don't ask for anything more until something gets to a long list stage, simply to save everyone time. Because if you have hundreds of applicants, you know from the get-go that most of them you're never going to hire. So it's until you get it down to the range of something like 20 people, it's better not to bother everyone with all the other documents. This is the increasing thinking. These norms have changed over time. So that it's more humane for everyone involved, that you have fewer letters to request from letter writers and so on and so forth. So when you think about these documents, they get read at different times at different moments. Like your job letter and your CV will be read initially, and they have to stand up to that. They have to make them clean, make them honest. Length isn't necessarily the most important thing. It's what the content is and how clearly it transmits what's strongest about your application. And you can't, you know, if it's not a position, you have to keep in mind, if it's an R1 position, then there'll also be lots of people who may have other jobs who are also applying. If it's a job that they may already have a position somewhere and they are hoping to move, or, there are many things going on. And so if it's a more local or regional college, or if it's a teaching college, then you want to make sure that you emphasize your teaching skills and your knowledge, and you show that you understand what the position actually is. So those things go into the job letter and the CV. They will also be read later on if you're lucky enough to make it to an on-campus interview in a world where there are on-campus interviews again, or at least Zoom interviews. They're going to be read again by people who haven't been a part of the search committee and are wanting to get a sense of who the different candidates are. They'll be read when you're being introduced. They'll be read at multiple occasions. So you have to think about these documents as going through different kinds of readings. And then the rest of the materials, it's partly to see a CV can look great, a job letter, a project can sound great, but eventually there'll be a question of what's the writing sample? Is there a there? And it's, absolutely you need to show that you have some track record of finishing things. That's part of what publication does, is it shows that you actually got something through all the steps and out, and so it's published. And then there's the question of when you get to the very final stages, people will really read your work more carefully, and just as they will listen to your talk more carefully. So you have to be ready for that moment as well, and prepared as you possibly can be. And each time you go to any different institution, there'll be a different set of actors, some of whom are very nice and rational, some of whom are maybe a little bit less so. This is a strange profession. You have all kinds of personalities. They don't necessarily all agree. The members of the search committee don't necessarily all agree, and the members of the department don't necessarily all agree. And it's going to be this micro-political moment. This is, again, why I was saying you have to have perspective. It's not just about you. It's what people imagine you stand for at a given moment and where you fit into the different narratives that are playing out in that little departmental moment. So that's what happens down the line different disciplines, different departments do cuts at different points and have different traditions of how you make those cuts. But essentially there's a long list and then a short list, the short list, and then there's a higher. And the higher may or may not, and then it becomes a negotiation, and it's a question whether the person accepts the job, and then the way that things would play out in any given setting.
I do have lots of thoughts, but we also have only 9 minutes. So I'm going to just be moderating, and in the interest of getting as many questions answered, maybe we will either keep the answers a little bit shorter or not have everybody come in at every time, just to make sure we get to everyone. But I think part of the consensus that I just heard is make sure your CV is super clear to anyone who read it, and your CV and your letter are such important documents. Make sure you get feedback on them before you send them out. Your employment lies on these documents, so get feedback. We have a question, we have 2 questions on the chat related to what we just discussed, and a question from Claire Webb, which I don't know if it connects to this or not. So maybe I will just group all 3 questions. I will read the ones from the chat and then ask Claire to ask hers. So related to the conversation we've just had, one of them is a very difficult to answer question. What is the weight given to the university from which the degree comes, whether it is a US institution or an institution abroad, or the institution, the prestige of the institution? And the other is, do search committees ever look at a candidate's online presence, such as Twitter, websites, and so on? And then Claire Webb, if you could ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thanks. This is really invaluable. My question is a little bit broader. It has to do with kind of timing. I'm sure you all know applying for postdocs takes up basically the entire fall semester. And I think I'm just wondering how you all would recommend kind of balancing turning the dissertation manuscript into a monograph, how to shop that around, how much to kind of milk that dissertation manuscript, how much to kind of like pull articles or pull chapters that would then turn into publishable standalone articles, how much to work on organizing conferences. I think I would love some clarity on kind of the timeline of adapting your doctoral research as kind of a transition into postdoctoral research, and how much time to devote to kind of like working on standalone articles that aren't a part of your dissertation research, but are also apart from your postdoc project, your second major project. Thanks.
However you guys want to take it. Maybe one suggestion I have is that since there's many ways to do things, right? There's no, as Peter R said, there's many paths. Maybe you guys could address not the one path, but some good moves and not so great moves.
Okay, so I'll jump in quickly on the social media question. I think it's inappropriate for committees to look at social media, but I don't know if people do it or not, to be honest. I've never done it. I never will do it. And I can't imagine a context in which I would do it. To speak to Claire's large specific question on the end, I think a hiring committee, if you want to work on a standalone article as opposed to developing a book manuscript, I think a hiring committee is probably fairly agnostic on that. They might have, some of them might have different opinions, but as long as it's leading towards publication, I think they would understand it. And as long as, again, as it ties into your larger story, about how you tell your story of the arc of your work, I think they will appreciate it.
I would just say, you know, better to have that article be, and I'm sure you guys know this, in a peer-reviewed journal rather than as a book chapter. At least at USC, it's been the case that those are valued, they're privileged over book chapters.
Yes, I would second that, and second the point that it's a question of the narrative that you tell. You need to be thinking about what would be sort of your calling card publication, the thing that would most define you as a scholar. I mean, because eventually, if you are going to have an academic career in a tenure track setting and go through tenure, you have to be defined as a particular kind of scholar on a particular trajectory. And so you need to be able to write a narrative that defines yourself that way. So, you know, start thinking about how the different pieces fit together. And I would say in terms of online presence, I would say for younger faculty, it's second nature to look people up. The way that I imagine most people in this room probably do, with different feelings about what is appropriate or not appropriate. But you should be conscious of what your online presence is. And there's also a lot of activity with blogs now in many domains, many areas, and that's a part of your production. And you can become well known as somebody. I mean, it's another way to network and get your name out and also become recognizable as a figure in a given field.
I just want to jump in. We skipped the question about the weight of the reputation of the university. I think that for this group, that is essentially moot. You've chosen to get a PhD at a certain place, and there's no way of reading what a hiring committee is going to think of someone getting a PhD from X as opposed to Y as opposed to Z. I think the important thing is to present your best case. If someone is hung up about one university versus another, nothing you can do is going to change that. So I wouldn't even worry about that question if it were me.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I was having a conversation with a graduate student recently in history, and she was talking about a historian by the name of Margot Kennedy, who teaches at Princeton. She's a big deal. And the graduate student said, you know, I think she got her PhD from Minnesota. And I said, really? I had always imagined it was Yale, just because of her sort of intellectual trajectory. But no, it was the University of Minnesota. And it is to say that it really is going to ride. I mean, I think it is going to ride more on the work itself than on the institutional affiliation, but that could be on my part somewhat wishful thinking.
I mean,
But
I would agree. I think ultimately it's about the longer you go on, that matters less and less,
Yeah.
obviously. But initially, it's about networks, and there will be moments, and some of the struggle in departments can be about networks.
we have 1 minute left, and I know that these days people's time is even more precious than ever, and more taxed. So I want to end in time. I just want to end by sort of returning to something that all 3 of the speakers said, and I'll phrase it in a slightly different time, which are moments of transition are always particularly delicate and vulnerable moments. But in this, as in any transition, is about finding the path that is the right path for you, and about being strategic, about thinking what best and most helps you get to where you want to go at this time, and choosing very wisely what projects you choose, what venues you publish in, how you spend your time, what conferences you go to. This will not be equally the case for the entirety of your career. But at this time, being very strategic, and also knowing that you don't and probably shouldn't go at this alone, and that conversations with mentors, with peers are extremely important. Nobody is born learning. Nobody is born knowing how to do this, and you have to learn. And community and mentoring really, really helps. So they all wanted to start on a downer. I want to end on an upper, I guess. I don't know what that says about you guys or about me. Thank you so much to Alice, to Peter, and to you all. I hope this has been a helpful workshop. Thank you for your questions. And I hope that we see you at the next one.